There are moments in history that seem to exist outside of time. Moments so powerful that decades can pass, entire generations can grow older, and yet the images remain as vivid as the day they happened. For millions of people around the world, January 28, 1986 became one of those moments. Even today, nearly 40 years later, mention the name Challenger, and countless people immediately picture the same scene without hesitation. A brilliant Florida sky, a white spacecraft climbing effortlessly higher and higher on a pillar of brilliant orange flame. A launch that appeared flawless. A moment of human achievement unfolding exactly as planned. Then, in less than the time it takes to sing a verse of a song, the impossible happened. A sudden bloom of white and orange smoke spread across the sky where the shuttle had been only an instant before. Two solid rocket boosters continued flying on separate paths, twisting through the air like giant white ribbons, while the vehicle they had been carrying simply disappeared. The cheers stopped. The excitement vanished. And millions of people watching around the world were left staring at an image they could not immediately understand. It lasted only 73 seconds, yet those 73 seconds became some of the most replayed footage in modern history. A moment frozen forever in the memories of everyone who witnessed it. But the explosion that the world saw was only the beginning of a much deeper story. What really happened to the Space Shuttle Challenger in those final moments? Where did the spacecraft go after it disappeared into that cloud of smoke? What happened in the minutes, days, and weeks that followed when the cameras moved away and the world stopped watching? The answers reveal a story far more complex, more tragic, and more human than most people ever realized. Before we uncover the details behind this forgotten chapter of the Challenger disaster, make sure to subscribe and support the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful historical stories to life and exploring the moments that changed the world forever. Now, let's go deeper into what really happened on that unforgettable morning. What made that morning unforgettable was not only the violence of what people witnessed, but the silence that followed. At Kennedy Space Center, thousands of spectators stood looking upward, waiting for someone to explain what they had just seen. Parents who had brought their children shaded their eyes against the bright winter sun, searching the sky for a spacecraft that no longer existed. Families of the astronauts continued staring upward long after the smoke had begun to drift apart, unable to believe that the launch they had celebrated only moments earlier had transformed into something else entirely. For several long seconds, nobody cheered, nobody spoke. The loudspeakers, usually filled with confident announcements and routine mission updates, suddenly struggled to find words. Even the calm, practiced voices that had narrated countless launches before sounded uncertain, because no script existed for what had just unfolded. Thousands of miles away, in classrooms across America, another audience watched the same images in complete confusion. Television sets had been wheeled into schools from New Hampshire to California because this mission was supposed to become a lesson unlike any other. Students had gathered around their screens with notebooks ready, excited by the promise that one of their own teachers would soon be teaching lessons directly from orbit. Many children had never watched a rocket launch before. They did not understand what they were seeing. Some thought the strange cloud of smoke was simply another part of the launch. Others waited for the shuttle to emerge from it. Around them, however, teachers had already begun to realize something had gone terribly wrong. They searched desperately for words that could explain a disaster they themselves could barely comprehend. Across the country, millions of children experienced the same moment of stunned silence together, unknowingly witnessing one of the defining events of the Space Shuttle era. That single image became permanently embedded in the memory of an entire generation. The branching white smoke trail against the impossible blue Florida sky would appear on television news broadcasts, documentaries, newspapers, magazines, history books, and eventually across the internet, replayed again and again until it became one of the most recognizable moments of the 20th century. Ask almost anyone who was alive that day where they were when Challenger launched, and many can still tell you. Some remember watching it at school. Others remember seeing it live on television at work or at home. They remember the shock. They remember the confusion. They remember exactly how they felt when the realization slowly spread that something irreversible had happened. Most people believe they already know the story because they know the image. They know the shuttle exploded. They know 7 astronauts died. They know the launch lasted only 73 seconds before ending in disaster. Over the years, those facts became so familiar that they almost replaced everything else. For many people, the explosion itself became the entire story. The fireball, the smoke, the broken trails across the sky. That was where history seemed to stop. It became easy to imagine that everything ended in a single instant, that what people saw on television represented the complete tragedy, and that nothing meaningful happened afterward, except an investigation into what caused the accident. But history is almost never that simple. The explosion that millions watched live was not the end of the Challenger story. In many ways, it was only the beginning. After the television cameras stopped broadcasting, after the reporters packed away their equipment, and after the public gradually turned toward the next headline, another story quietly unfolded far from the cameras and far beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. It was a story of divers descending into dark water, of ships searching an enormous debris field piece by painstaking piece, of investigators confronting questions that had no easy answers, and of families waiting through endless days for news they dreaded receiving. It became one of the largest recovery operations in NASA's history, carried out not under the glare of television lights, but in silence, professionalism, and extraordinary dignity. This is the part of the Challenger disaster that most people have never heard in detail, not because it was deliberately hidden, but because those responsible believed some parts of the story belonged first to the families who had lost husbands, wives, parents, sons, daughters, colleagues, and friends. NASA understood almost immediately that recovering the crew and examining what remained would require an unusual balance between public responsibility and private compassion. Every decision that followed had to respect both scientific truth and human grief. Over the years, that discretion has sometimes been misunderstood as secrecy or even as evidence of a cover-up. It was neither. It was an attempt to ensure that one of America's greatest tragedies did not become a public spectacle at the expense of the people who suffered it most. That is why this story deserves to be told carefully, not dramatically, not sensationally. There is no need to invent mysteries where the historical record already carries enough weight on its own. The facts are heartbreaking enough. Some questions investigators answered with certainty. Others remain impossible to answer completely. Throughout this documentary, we will stay with what is known, acknowledge what remains uncertain, and remember that behind every technical report, every engineering diagram, and every recovered fragment of the spacecraft were 7 human beings who climbed aboard Challenger believing they would spend the next week exploring space, not become part of history. Their story deserves accuracy. More importantly, it deserves humanity. This is where the story truly begins. The reinforced crew cabin had been designed to protect astronauts during the enormous stresses of launch and re-entry, but it had never been designed to survive what had just happened. Unlike the earliest space shuttle test flights, which carried only 2 astronauts, and were equipped with experimental ejection seats, Challenger was flying in its fully operational configuration with 7 people aboard. Once the shuttle program expanded beyond those initial tests, the ejection seats were removed because they could not safely save a full crew during most phases of flight. No escape capsule existed. No emergency parachute system could lower the entire cabin back to Earth. Engineers had designed the vehicle around a single assumption: catastrophic structural failure during ascent simply would not be survivable. If such a failure ever occurred, there was no secondary plan waiting in reserve. There was only the hope that it never would. That reality meant the cabin, once separated from the rest of the orbiter, became little more than a sealed aluminum and composite shell moving entirely under the laws of physics. After reaching the top of its ballistic arc, gravity slowly overcame the upward momentum that had carried it nearly 12 miles above the Atlantic Ocean. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the cabin began its descent. It did not plunge straight downward like a stone. It tumbled, rotated, and accelerated through the thin upper atmosphere, gradually falling faster as the denser air rushed past its scarred exterior. From the moment it reached its highest point until it struck the ocean below, approximately 2 minutes and 45 seconds passed. Nearly 3 full minutes. In everyday life, 3 minutes disappear almost unnoticed. They are enough time to finish reading a newspaper article, walk the length of a hallway, brew a cup of coffee, or hear the opening verses of a favorite song. In this story, however, those same 3 minutes stretch into one of the longest and most haunting intervals in the history of human spaceflight. During much of that descent, the cabin and everything inside it were in free fall. Physically, that meant the astronauts would not have felt themselves falling in the way people imagine falling from great heights. Instead, the cabin and its occupants were accelerating together under gravity, creating the same sensation of weightlessness they had spent years training to experience in orbit. Ironically, the floating environment they had prepared for throughout their careers arrived not hundreds of miles above Earth as planned, but during an uncontrolled descent through the atmosphere. Outside the small windows, the Atlantic Ocean remained far below, invisible for much of the fall, while the cabin slowly rotated through the sky. Inside that reinforced compartment, 7 people who had expected to begin a week-long scientific mission were instead suspended within a sequence of events that no simulator, no checklist, and no emergency procedure had ever prepared them for. Eventually, gravity completed what momentum had begun. The cabin struck the Atlantic Ocean at an estimated speed of roughly 207 miles per hour. At those velocities, water ceases to behave like the gentle, yielding surface people experience from a boat or a beach. Physicists have long understood that liquids resist sudden compression, and at extreme impact speeds, the ocean behaves much more like an unyielding solid than a soft cushion. The forces generated during that final instant were immense. The structure absorbed a catastrophic deceleration measured in fractions of a second. Later in this documentary, we will return carefully to what the medical investigation ultimately concluded about those final moments, because the evidence deserves to be explained accurately and respectfully. For now, it is enough to understand one simple fact. The long fall ended with a force from which there was no possibility of survival. Yet none of the people standing on the ground knew any of this. While the crew cabin was still completing its silent descent toward the Atlantic, Mission Control in Houston was confronting a very different mystery. Engineers and flight controllers had spent years training for malfunctions of every imaginable kind. Engines could fail. Computers could malfunction. Sensors could produce false readings. Communications could drop temporarily. Every conceivable emergency had procedures attached to it. What they had not trained for was the complete and instantaneous disappearance of an entire spacecraft. The first sign that something was terribly wrong did not come from the television cameras. It came from the data. Every fraction of a second, Challenger transmitted an enormous stream of telemetry back to Mission Control. Thousands of measurements reporting engine performance, hydraulic pressure, fuel levels, electrical systems, structural loads, temperatures, velocities, guidance information, and countless other parameters that allowed controllers to monitor the vehicle in real time. Then, without warning, that constant flow simply stopped. Numbers that had been updating continuously froze in place. New information never arrived. The electronic heartbeat of the spacecraft had gone silent. At the same time, tracking cameras continued following the expanding cloud high above the Atlantic. Instead of the familiar silhouette of the orbiter climbing steadily toward orbit, operators saw something they had never expected to witness. A branching mass of smoke spread outward across the blue sky, while two brilliant white trails peeled away from each other in opposite directions. The shuttle itself had disappeared, but the solid rocket boosters, still firing independently after separating from the destroyed external tank, continued flying under their own thrust. They twisted and corkscrewed across the sky, leaving behind two long spirals of white smoke that would become one of the defining visual images of the 20th century. Inside Mission Control, professionalism demanded calm even as uncertainty spread through the room. Every controller understood that panic served no purpose. Voices remained measured, procedures continued, data was checked and rechecked. Then Flight Dynamics Officer Steve Nesbitt broke the silence with words delivered in the restrained language that NASA culture demanded. He reported that the vehicle had apparently experienced, in his understated phrase, a major malfunction. Those three words have since become one of the most haunting statements ever spoken during an American space mission. They reflected neither denial nor confusion. They reflected the discipline of a profession trained never to speculate before evidence existed. But behind the calm wording, many controllers already suspected the truth. Spacecraft did not simply vanish from telemetry unless something catastrophic had occurred. Outside, among the thousands gathered near Launch Complex 39B, realization arrived far more slowly. Unlike the engineers inside Mission Control, most spectators had never watched dozens of shuttle launches. They did not immediately recognize that the branching smoke cloud represented disaster. Some even applauded for several seconds after the breakup, believing they were watching a planned stage of the ascent. After all, solid rocket boosters always separated from the shuttle. To an inexperienced eye, two boosters flying away from each other could appear perfectly normal. It took precious moments before people began noticing what was missing. The orbiter never emerged. The bright white spacecraft that should have continued climbing simply was not there. The public address announcer continued speaking in the practiced rhythm used during every launch, but even his confidence began to fade as fresh information failed to arrive. Sentences trailed off. Long pauses replaced routine mission updates. Around the viewing areas, conversation stopped almost entirely. Parents held children a little closer. Spouses searched the sky through binoculars. Family members of the astronauts stood staring upward, hoping for an explanation that refused to come. Slowly, almost visibly, the understanding spread through the crowd like a shadow, moving across open ground. Something unimaginable had happened, and everyone present knew they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered forever. Perhaps nowhere was that realization more heartbreaking than inside American classrooms. Challenger was carrying Krista McAuliffe, a social studies teacher selected from more than 11,000 applicants to become the first participant in NASA's Teacher in Space project. Because of her presence aboard the mission, Schools across the United States had transformed the launch into a national educational event. Television sets had been rolled into classrooms. Lesson plans had been rewritten. Students sat cross-legged on classroom floors or leaned forward in their desks, excited to watch someone who represented ordinary teachers accomplish something extraordinary. When the smoke suddenly blossomed across the screen, most children had no idea what they were witnessing. Many waited for the spacecraft to reappear. Instead, they watched their teachers struggle to explain an event that none of them had expected to see. For countless educators, those minutes became some of the hardest they would ever spend in front of a classroom. That is why the Challenger disaster occupies such a unique place in modern memory. Unlike many historic tragedies that were reconstructed later through photographs or written accounts, this one unfolded live before millions of viewers. It happened in broad daylight, transmitted into homes and schools as it occurred, leaving almost no distance between the event and those who witnessed it. The branching smoke, the twisting rocket boosters, and the brilliant blue Florida sky became images that entire generations would carry with them for the rest of their lives. But while the public remained fixed on those images above the horizon, another story had already begun beneath it. The fireball everyone remembered belonged to the external tank. The crew cabin had continued its long descent and now rested somewhere on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. Finding it, recovering it, and bringing home the 7 people inside would become the responsibility of hundreds of men and women who, over the weeks ahead, would undertake one of the largest and most emotionally demanding recovery operations in NASA's history. During the first hours after the breakup, however, no one was prepared to abandon hope, not officially. Emergency procedures required responders to assume that lives might still be saved until the evidence proved otherwise. Within minutes, the United States Coast Guard launched aircraft from nearby stations. Search helicopters lifted into the clear winter sky and headed toward the growing debris field, their crews scanning the waves below with binoculars, searching for any sign that defied the odds. A life raft, a floating section of wreckage, a bright orange survival marker, even the briefest movement among the swells. Every possibility, no matter how unlikely, had to be investigated. The first Coast Guard aircraft reached the growing debris field within a remarkably short time. Behind them came helicopters from nearby stations, Navy patrol aircraft, and ships already operating off the Florida coast. Naval vessels received new orders and immediately altered course toward the last known position of Challenger, while civilian boats in the surrounding waters were instructed to assist wherever they could. To the public, it looked like an enormous emergency response unfolding across the Atlantic. And officially, that is exactly what it was. Every disaster begins with the same assumption. Somewhere, somehow, there may still be someone alive. Search and rescue doctrine leaves no room for pessimism. Until there is absolute proof to the contrary, every minute belongs to hope. The men and women flying low over the Atlantic understood that responsibility better than anyone. Helicopter crews scanned the water through binoculars. Rescue swimmers prepared their equipment, and sailors stood along the rails of approaching ships, searching every patch of ocean for movement. They looked for life rafts, flotation devices, emergency beacons. Anything that might suggest the impossible had somehow become possible. It did not matter how unlikely survival seemed. Their training demanded that they search as though lives still depended upon it, because in those first uncertain hours, no one had the authority to decide otherwise. Yet among those who knew the shuttle's engineering intimately, another reality was already settling in. The people who had built the spacecraft, studied its systems, and understood its limitations recognized almost immediately what the public did not. Challenger had never been designed with a means of escaping a catastrophic breakup during ascent. Earlier experimental shuttle flights had briefly used ejection seats for 2 astronauts, but operational missions carrying larger crews had no such capability. There were no escape capsules, no parachutes capable of lowering the crew compartment safely from nearly 12 miles above the Atlantic. No emergency system that could separate the cabin and carry it gently back to Earth. The orbiter had been engineered under the assumption that a structural failure of this magnitude simply would not occur. In the language of aerospace engineering, there was no abort mode for the sequence of events that had just unfolded. That knowledge weighed heavily on the rescue crews, even as they continued searching. The helicopter pilots flying search patterns, the Coast Guard swimmers preparing to enter cold water, and the sailors leaning over steel railings all understood, at least privately, what the mission was likely to become. Still, no one stopped searching. Hope, however small, deserved its chance. It always does. The Atlantic Ocean, however, offered little assistance. High-altitude winds had carried debris over an enormous area before it reached the surface. Ocean currents immediately began spreading floating wreckage even farther apart. Thousands of individual fragments drifted away from one another, each following its own path through the water. Lightweight insulation floated. Pieces of thermal protection tile bobbed briefly before becoming waterlogged. Larger structural components disappeared beneath the waves almost immediately, pulled toward the seafloor by their own weight. Every passing hour made the search area larger, more complicated, and more difficult to reconstruct. Recovery crews did manage to collect debris during that very first day. Boats retrieved fragments of insulation, scorched metal panels, broken equipment, and pieces of the orbiter's distinctive white thermal tiles. Each fragment was carefully catalogued because every piece might later help investigators understand precisely how Challenger had come apart. To an outside observer, these may have looked like meaningless scraps of wreckage. To engineers, each fragment represented evidence. Every crack, every burn mark, every broken attachment point preserved part of the final sequence of the accident. But the one object everyone wanted to find remained missing. The reinforced crew cabin had never resurfaced,